Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about an introduction to more advanced security topics and doing some threat analysis for security. So, one of the things that we have to think about first is ethical considerations. So, whenever we're talking about security in any capacity, we have to talk about ethics. Now, this entire course is really focused on something called ethical hacking. Ethical hacking comes through the world in a lot of different ways. One of the big ones is how we are actually handling the information and performing the tasks that we need to perform in a way that is going to be mindful of the situation that we're in and the data and the sensitive data that we might be working with. What I mean here. Well, it is true that we've probably all seen in the news things like hackers have attacked whatever it is. An ethical hacker is somebody who, rather than attacks a company for profit or for laughs or whatever it happens to be, it's somebody who takes the skills that they've learned and uses them for good. As we all know, we have great responsibility when we have great power. And being able to work in security, understand how these tools work, gives us great power. Now, ethical hacking is where we are taking the same concepts of this is what it would look like if an attack was performed, but because the people performing the simulated attack are actually going to be giving a report at the end of where the vulnerabilities were, it's really a different thing. So we end up having these ethical hacking jobs, ethical hacking certifications, so that people can learn how to take all of the knowledge and the skills that they have in relation to computers, security, and computer hacking and use them for good. So, the ethical hacking certification, certified ethical hacker, comes through the Ethical Hacking Council. Um, One of the ways that we can look at this, so in security, we have something called black hats and white hats. Now, these terms are still problematic and they aren't necessarily the best ones to use. We really don't want to have any variety of colors associated with good or evil the way that these terms do. However, it is true that you are going to see in industry a lot of black hats, white hats, and gray hats. White hat means somebody who's sort of on the right side of the law. Black hat is somebody who is on the bad side, and a gray hat is somebody in between. So we have people who are trying to look at things from the perspective of a black hat without actually being one. So let's take an example of a burglar tossing a room. So if a burglar comes into a house and starts trying to look for valuables, the way that they are actually going about looking for valuables can inform us for how best to protect our valuables. So let's say, for example, I know that if a burglar is going to come in and toss my room and they see a bureau with drawers, the way that they are more experienced burglars will come in and look through the drawers is they'll start at the bottom and work their way up so that they don't have to close drawers as they go. So that means if I'm trying to buy more time, I would actually sort of counterintuitively probably put things in the back of one of the top drawers. But I wouldn't necessarily know that I needed to do that unless I knew how a burglar tossed a room. So that's kind of why we end up having this perspective. Now, the Security Plus certification that you may have heard of and might be interested in is a really good grounding and overview of security in general for everybody. Whereas a certified ethical hacker is really taking a step down a particular path where they are going to be having more specific jobs and skill sets that are going to match what they're going to be learning. Now, normally I would have an activity where we would have an ethical discussion in course. Um, If we were in person, these are the two topics that I would end up giving options for in groups. I have a couple of others as well. So, what you can do is actually just pause me here and start thinking about either one or both of these topics. Now, this particular chart was actually somebody made it and it was shared on Reddit. One of the things that ends up happening with all fields, but especially with computer science, is nobody can know everything. So, being able to share our knowledge is really helpful. And what this person, or I should say, people, have done is actually work on putting all of the different certification options together and then making them a really nice visual representation. So, for example, you can actually see the Security Plus here and where that was coming from with our 115 class being a really good baseline in security architecture, security management, security analysis. Whereas the certified ethical hacker, which is what this course is focused on, is going to be a good baseline for offense and defense with a little bit of security analysis. But you can see all of these are actually really entry level certifications. If you wanted to go down one of these paths, you would have to pick which certifications you wanted to go down that would be significantly more difficult to get. So, for example, the Security Plus certification as of 2022 is a couple of $100s. After you take our 115 class, you're probably about 85% of the way there towards it. And the last bit that you'd need to worry about is vocabulary and how they answer the questions. However, if we started going up into some of these other certifications, what you'll actually see is the cost of the certification goes up significantly, as does the expectations of that certification, as does the failure rates. So, some of these certifications might only have a failure rate of, 10%, 20%. But once you start getting into some of the upper level certifications, that could have failure rates up into the 50% or more category. Now, one of the things that this is really helpful for is it would give you an idea of some paths that you could take if you are interested in this. So, you could look at security architecture, so the building blocks of how systems are put together, security management, how we work with those building blocks, security analysis, how we can sort of look over and get information about companies or these building blocks. We could do security implementations, so these would be the people that are actually going to be taking the rules that have been created and putting those rules into play. Then we could also have defense and offense. Now, offense and defense, this is where we talk about red teaming, blue teaming, and purple teaming, which we will talk about a little bit later. And the idea is these are the people that are going to attack and protect companies. Now, when we talk about vulnerabilities and vulnerability assessment, we can actually look at this sort of with pen testing. Now, pen testing as a whole, we're going to talk about in a little bit, but the idea behind pen testing is we are taking an outside perspective and we are looking at a company and we are seeing what is out there. Vulnerability assessment is where we are looking at the potential holes in a company's defenses. Now, all of this is actually going to come with something called threat assessment. When we do threat assessment in security, what we're really looking for is things like how serious is the threat, what can be lost if something is exposed, and how likely is it to be exposed. So, the example that I always use in class is if I'm standing in the front of a classroom, how likely is it that I'm going to be hit by a bus? Now, technically, being hit by a bus is something that happens. It is a threat. It is technically possible. However, especially let's say if I'm on the second story of a building and I'm in an interior room, the likelihood of a bus coming in and hitting me isn't really very high. So maybe that's not something that I want to spend a lot of time worrying about. But you know, unfortunately, one of the things that ends up happening is there are some things that we do want to spend time worrying about. At the front of a classroom, I'm probably not concerned about being hit by a bus, but if I'm walking down the street, I have headphones in, I'm texting on my phone, or if you know me at all, I'm playing a game on my phone, and I'm walking without looking up at my surroundings. That would then take the worry about being hit by a bus, and it would be a problem. So, with a company, we want to do the same sort of thing. What's sort of likely to happen, and how do we decide how we prioritize what's going to happen? Now, sometimes these vulnerabilities are internal knowledge, so we know working at a company that there's a vulnerability with how passwords are managed, but maybe from the outside it's not as obvious. So that's why we have both pen testing and security audit so that we can look at both. But when we're looking at these threats, we really want to think about for the company, what is the most concerning? What do we want to prioritize? What are we most worried about? And how can we work with those? Because there's always going to be an endless laundry list of issues to worry about. Now, when we talked about the offense and defense, we have red team, blue team, and then purple team. Now, red team is we're going to call them the attack team. They are the ones that are pretending to be the bad guys. They are going to say, hey, if I was attacker looking at this company, what would I see? This is going to be somewhat lawless because they are pretend bad people. So we can't really say, oh, well, I mean, if we were worried about being pickpocketed, well, the only time you can pickpocket me is between 2 and 2:45 p.m. We know that's not really reasonable. So we have to give them a little bit more leeway so that it's a little bit more accurate. Now, the blue team is the one that's going to be doing the defense. They are the ones that is they're trying to protect the company from attackers, both the real attackers and the fake attackers of the red team. And what they're trying to do is take all of these vulnerabilities and find ways to mitigate them, manage them, patch them, and make sure that all of these vulnerabilities are as protected as possible. Now, a purple team is something we've seen more and more in the last couple of years, and the idea is red and blue teams have to cooperate. The goal is communication. This isn't necessarily a separate team, but it is absolutely the case that one of the issues that can happen is if you have even simulated verses, it can start getting really contentious. I'm going to use a sports example here. If you are taking a class at Northern Essex, you know that we are in the New England area. And as anybody who's in New England knows, you have to root for the Red Sox. Now, let's say, however, if you know anything about baseball, you know that the Red Sox and the Yankees have, shall we say, a bit of a rivalry going. And if we think about them as versus Red Sox versus Yankees, one of the things that we'll know is people can get really upset and into their team, and it's not always easy to get people to work together. So if you kind of think about the Red Sox versus the Yankees and they were in a World Series, would you be able to get a super fan from each one to be able to actually communicate and have a reasonable conversation? Now, if you live in New England or New York, you know the answer is no, that's not going to happen. So part of what a purple team would do is they would help these two people start getting along a little better, communicate better, and see the similarities so that they don't get into too much of a rivalry. Now, a security audit is different than a pen test. So, a security audit is where we're actually looking through our security policies from the internal of the company to look for vulnerabilities. This is going to have internal cooperation. We're looking at best practices and we're looking at the documentation. We want to actually see what is written down, what are the rules that we have that people have written down that we need to follow for security. So let's say, for example, going back to passwords. If we have a company, they probably have a password policy, something like you have to have a password of, let's say, at least 10 characters. One of them has to be a capital letter. So the security audit would come through and say, is this still the best practices? So a change that we've had recently is changing passwords. Companies were changing passwords every 90 days. And this is actually considered outdated advice now. This is no longer the recommendation. So a security audit would be able to come in and say, hey, actually changing passwords is no longer the recommendation. And instead of 10 characters, it really needs to be 12 characters, a capital letter, and a special character. And then the security audit would be able to make those recommendations to be able to change the documentation so that we can actually see what's going on. Whereas a pen test wouldn't see any of those internals. All they would see is, oh, it looks like somebody had a really bad password, password 1234. Well, that was really easy to crack. That is going to be our way in. So it's really a different perspective of how we're looking at things. A pen test is coming from the outside. It's going to be generally an outside contractor. The internal versions of these would be red team, blue team, or purple team. One of the things that's really, really important about pen testing is we always have to think about pen testing as it's a snapshot in time. The vulnerabilities that we find while we're pen testing is not always guaranteed to be there. It's just what we found when the testing was done. Reassessments will generally need to happen. Usually the recommendation is yearly. But the idea is you can't just say, oh, well, I've had this one pen test. I've now fixed everything forever. It's, I had this one pen test at that one particular point in time. These were the vulnerabilities that were there. How do we want to deal with that? We also have to make sure that we have proper authorizations for everything. Pen testing has a surprising amount of paperwork. There's potential legal issues. You have to have contracts worked on by people who very much know what they're talking about. And you have to make sure that everybody understands everything that's going to happen. We're going to talk a little bit more about pen testing and how it works in a little bit, but it is something to think about that there is actually a surprising amount of paperwork. It's not like they just say, go hack this big company. They have very specific plans and rules in place before any of that would happen. Now, pen testing has something called rules of engagement. The rules of engagement for pen testing is specifically spelling out what we are allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and this is going to include things like when the test is being done. So we're not just saying we're going to do a pen test at some point in the next year. It's at some point during the month of June, we're going to do a pen test on this company. We have to say who's doing the test, so the outside contractor would end up having a list of everybody who would be performing the test, and there's something called scope. Scope is what's allowed and what's not allowed during the test, and this needs to be spelled out very carefully. So, for example, do we need to notify people that this test is happening? What's our jurisdiction? So, if we have a company that is fully remote, how does that affect a pen test? Because now all of a sudden we're talking about hacking computers across state lines. What if we have a company that uses the cloud really heavily? That's super common right now where a lot of people will pay places like Amazon or Microsoft or Google to get access to these buckets of data. And if these buckets of data are in another state or another country, you don't necessarily know where that computer in the cloud is. You just know there's a computer in the cloud. So we have to make sure that we're paying attention to which laws apply there, how that ends up actually working, and spelling out, can we hit these buckets of data? Are we allowed to look at these servers? Are there some servers we are allowed to work on? Are there some servers we aren't? All of these are really important to think about as we're spelling out the rules for how this pen test is going to occur. Now, we have something called a get out of jail free card. Basically, the idea is if you're going to be performing a pen test, you have to have the proper authorization, the proper paperwork, proper identification, and you need to make sure that you have it all on you. One of the things that happens is if you have a botched contract, if you have a problem, the person doing the pen test can get into a lot of trouble and they might end up spending a night in jail if they don't have sort of all of their I's dotted and, T's crossed type of thing. Now, all of this is really important for a company to think about though, because a company can't just say, well, we're never going to get hacked. That's not reasonable. A company can't say, well, I've given the hackers rules. They can only steal from us on Thursday evenings. Like, that's not reasonable either. So it's important that we are paying attention to all of the potential issues that could happen because that will give us the best protection for the company. Now, the scope of the pen test is where we are going to be spelling out exactly what we are allowed to do. So, sorry about that. The scope of the pen test is where we are actually spelling out what we are allowed to do. And as we are going through and doing this, what we're going to do is make some decisions in terms of we can look at things like a time frame. We're probably going to have a specific week or month time frame. We're also probably going to look at some tools. So let's say, for example, we're doing a pen test and we are allowed to hit servers, we're allowed to do some scans, but we need to be really careful that we don't do anything that would accidentally take down the server. Maybe we have specific IP ranges. Maybe we have some specific internal or external websites that we are allowed to look at or we're not allowed to look at. Maybe we have a physical location. Maybe we don't. That needs to be spelled out as well. We also have to think about, do we have cooperation from inside? Does anybody know what's happening or not? And we also have to think about some limits. So, like, for example, DDoS or distributed denial of service is generally going to be out from a pen test because that can potentially take down the company. And we don't want to accidentally take down anything that we're working on. We just want to help them figure out where the vulnerabilities are. Social engineering, so things like phishing attacks, simulated phishing attacks, are actually becoming more and more common, and sometimes those are allowed, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes you're allowed to go look at things like the social media of the employees, sometimes you're not, and all of that would also get spelled out in the pen test. So it's really important that all of this is actually added to our rules and our contract so that we know exactly what's going to be happening and we have everything clearly spelled out so that everybody's on the same page. And this is why you can end up having these really, really long contracts. And if we're able to spell out all of these rules carefully, make sure that everybody is on board and in agreement, and we have all of the appropriate signatures and disclosures and cooperation, being able to do a pen test of a company can give them some really valuable information. What does somebody outside the company actually see? Somebody who's coming in with basically a fresh set of eyes. What are they seeing? How is it working? What's going on? What data is out there? What's the footprint of the company? All of that is really important. So, this was an introduction to ethical hacking and more advanced security topics. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely day.